On the morning of our preschool service, some of you may remember it, I spoke. Some of you may remember that, or you may have forgotten or fallen asleep. But I talked about how much I love the unpredictable nature of a children's nativity. It brings me great joy because the children are taking part, but I do love that fact you can't quite be sure what's going to happen when you put children up the front. It does not matter how much time 19 Down have spent rehearsing. It doesn't matter how well they've done their lines when they are out the back. There is just something unpredictable about children having that opportunity. Now, our children behaved incredibly well. It went very smoothly. But there are always those occasions when things don't quite work. And I believe we saw in that this understanding that Christmas was messy. That first Christmas was messy. It was a little bit unplanned and things didn't go as maybe we would want them to. And so before we begin, I just want us to watch another nativity that didn't quite go maybe as the church leader would have liked it to. No children, no baby Jesuses or sheep were hurt during that nativity. But it does highlight that often our best laid plans can fall apart. No matter how much preparation goes in, it doesn't run as we would like it to. And as we look at that first Christmas, we see an unplanned journey. There's a pregnant teenager, unmarried, going to a busy town with no place to stay, a baby born in an afterthought of a space, a feeding trough for his bed. And then, as we talked about, a collection of uninvited guests. Dare I say, we probably see more of that first Christmas in a nativity like that than sometimes we do in the polished efforts that can be put together. There's something about the reality of the mess that is crucial for us to understand. So I began to think, because the more things are polished, the more they begin to be perfect, the more I feel like I cannot come to a Jesus like this. The more things seem like they need to be perfect, the more we begin to hear phrases like, I'll come when I'm ready. When I feel good enough. When I've done enough, then I will come and serve on team. Then I will get baptized. Then I'll give my life to Jesus. For some reason, we've made things so perfect, we believe somehow we need to achieve something to be able to come. We seem to forget the mess that Jesus arrived into. It's as if we never really learn anything from the situation of Jesus coming into a hurting world, into a country torn apart by conflict, oppression, and greed, born to ill-prepared parents. In fact, the more I've considered the setting in which Jesus arrived into, the more I've realized that we need to not save the nativity story for December the 25th, but begin to understand it across our whole lives, all year round. Because if we actually learn anything from the mess that Jesus arrives into, it should be this. Jesus is more than able to enter the mess of your life. This is so important for us to understand as we begin, because when we make everything perfect, we don't feel like Jesus wants to be a part of the mess that we have. And yet when we begin to understand the setting he arrived into that first Christmas, we begin to realize that all the parts of our life that we feel are a mess, he is able to enter into. Jesus is able to enter into them, and he exampled that at that first Christmas. When God sent his son down into a messy environment, in an unplanned way, in a way that none of us would ever consider the best opportunity for God to speak. And yet we see the example set then. Jesus is able to enter the mess of our lives. Which begs the question, why do we as Christians spend so much time pretending we have it all together? Why? Why do we spend so much time presenting a version of ourselves to one another and often to God that is not who we are? Because Jesus is about the real us. Jesus wants to be a part of the real lives that we live. In fact, our mess is exactly where he wants to be. He doesn't want to be saved for Sundays when we put on our best outfit, slap on a smile, and pretend everything is fine. Jesus wants to be a part of our whole lives. So this morning I want us to look at a very well-known encounter that Jesus has that I think helps example some of what I want to talk about. It's an encounter had by someone whose life, I think it would be fair to say, is a mess. So if you have your Bibles with me or on your phone, if you would turn to John 8, 2-11, I'm going to read this encounter. So John 8, 2-11, it will be on the screens as well. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the oldest ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." If that first Christmas teaches us anything, I trust it teaches us much. But I pray it does teach us this. We need to learn again that God's willingness, God's plan to have his son born in an out-of-the-way, unspectacular town, to an unknown teenage girl amongst cattle at a time of turmoil for his people under Roman oppression. It teaches us that Jesus is best placed right in the middle of the mess we often find ourselves in. Jesus is best placed right in the middle of the mess we often find ourselves in. As we read of his life in the Gospels, we read time and time again of him being in situations and in places where life is messy, where things are not going to plan. Illness, bleeds, demon possession. Jesus is in the middle of the places where maybe when we make everything perfect, we don't imagine him to be sat at the table of a tax collector eating. Jesus is best placed to be with us in amongst the mess. So much so that I believe Jesus isn't repulsed by the mess of our life. He is heartbroken. And by coming to earth as a baby, he stepped right into it and made a way out. We have to understand that Jesus did not come for perfect people. Instead, he came to save those of us whose lives are a mess. And there's so much that we could unpack in this passage about the setting, the setup of the woman, but that's not what I want to focus on today. What I want to focus on is the fact that this woman's life was a mess. We don't know how it had got to the point it was at. But if her life looks anything like any of ours, then what would have happened is something would have started it. And then it would have escalated. And before long, the situation was too big for her to find a way out of. So much so, she now finds herself stood before this teacher. Before this Jesus who has performed incredible miracles, who's spoken in a way people had never heard before. And she is stood there with the shame of her situation etched on her face. I think it's fair to conclude this woman's life is a mess. This situation is messy. So much so, she is now stood condemned to die. The problem I find at this point, it's a good point, thank you. Do you want me to switch to Mark's mic? Better? Hello. There we are, I'll edit this out of the video. No one else will know this happened. As I said, we find this woman in a situation where her life is a mess, and she's now stood before Jesus, condemned to die. And that creates for me the first significant problem I've experienced as a Christian. You see, for many in the world, their understanding of Jesus and of church is what we see of the Pharisees in this moment. For what much of the world assumes of the church is that we are stood there looking for their faults, waiting to tell them how much of a failure they are, stone in hand, ready to condemn them. That's how the world views a lot of the church, as the Pharisees in this story. The reason it's a real problem for me is there are times when I lapse into that worldview and begin to worry that somehow I need to present something to Jesus that is more than who I am, is perfect in some way. And I start to assume Jesus is now just living life looking for the faults that I have. Completely detracting from who Jesus is, we get caught in the trap of assuming somehow we need to perfect ourselves to be in his presence, rather than welcoming him into the mess that we find ourselves in. I wonder how many of us get caught in that trap of thinking that church, Christians, and Jesus himself can be like the Pharisees are in this moment. Because when we do that, and as a church, when we present that, we have somehow disconnected a loving God from a broken people. That's what we do when we leave the world thinking Jesus doesn't love them. Somehow we have placed the baby back in the manger and tucked away that part of the story, rather than looking at the life that he lived of love and of a death and of a sacrifice made for you and for me and for all people. Why? Why does this need to happen? Why did we have to have the cross? Because of the mess of our lives. The very reason we have this story is because life is messy. So I want to ask, what can we learn from this interaction? What are the things we can take away? Because this woman's life is a mess, and it has left her condemned to death. She stands there before Jesus guilty of the crime that she is accused of. All of the mess and all of the mistakes, all of the shame and all of the guilt is now on display for all to see as she stands there. Stood before my Savior, I find myself a sinner. I may not be in the same situation this woman finds herself, but I couldn't stand here with integrity without saying I could stand before Jesus with shame, with parts of my life that I would not want on display. So what can we learn if we are willing to admit that maybe we could be stood side by side with this woman before Jesus? It begs the question at this point as the Pharisees challenge Jesus for us to ask, who is this Jesus? This babe wrapped in swaddling and placed in a manger, who is he? Now that he's faced with this very real question, this very real reality for this woman's life. You see, this man, once born to an unmarried teenager, now holds this woman's life in his hands. And we see something beautiful. Because Emmanuel, God with us, is about to example to us what it looks like when we allow the mess of life to collide with the glory of God. That's what we see here. We see the glory of God colliding with the mess of life, and we see who Jesus truly is. Who he is for this woman and who I believe he is for us. So I want to look very briefly at 3 points in this story. The first one is this. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Now, many people have talked about what he wrote. There have been debates, there have been preachers. I've realized living in Wales, the reason we want to know what he wrote is because we're nosy. That's the truth of it. Mark always tells me the first thing people ask is, what's your surname? Where'd you come from? Who are you related to? We're nosy. So I don't want to consider necessarily what he wrote. I want to consider the action. Because this woman's life is on the line. This woman's life is a mess. She is condemned to death. She has stood before a crowd. And with all of those people watching, with the Pharisees pushing for death or denial, Jesus bends down to write in the dirt. Remember the setting into which Jesus bends down to write. Because I've never understood why we are so focused on what he wrote. Because my response would be, Jesus, please could you hurry up? Please could we get through this? This is awkward for everybody. There is a woman stood in the shame of the reality of her life. There are Pharisees trying to work out whether they can condemn you to death or condemn her to death. So I love that you want to go down and do some Etch-a-Sketch in the sand, but really, could you hurry up and get to the point where we find out what's going on here? This is a huge deal. Please understand, this woman is condemned to death. That's what should happen. And we see Jesus in no hurry bend down and write in the sand. This tells me something crucial. Tells me something that I think we overlook when we get hung up on some of the details in this story. Because what this tells me, Jesus' response to this whole situation tells me, is he's not going to be held by the demands of man. He's not on our timeline. Those of us that have prayed for things in 2023, assuming they would have been answered in 2023, may find God's timeline sees them answered in 2024. Because Jesus isn't held by the Pharisees' timeline or the woman's timeline. At this point, Jesus is being Jesus, doing things as he sees fit, in a way that he sees fit. So no, I don't know what he wrote in the sand, but I do want him to hurry up because of my humanity. Jesus is well aware of the magnitude of the moment, but he is already in a position that sometimes we can wonder if the truth is this. You see, Jesus was in no rush, and Jesus was willing to bend down and start writing on the ground because Jesus already loved the woman. Jesus already knew her. In fact, this baby born into a manger was on his way to Calvary because of this woman, because of me, and because of you. So Jesus is in no hurry because love is already guaranteed. Jesus loved her. In her shame, in the mess, in the humiliation, in that crowd of people watching intently to see what Jesus would do with this woman stood before him. And he bends down and writes in the ground because he already loves her. What an incredible truth for us to hold on to. That in the middle of the mess, his love for us is already guaranteed. Already secured, already a promise that is being fulfilled. So no matter what it is that you stand beside her with, know this: Jesus loves you. There is no rush in this moment because God's plan is in action. Emmanuel was born and Calvary is coming. And that cry of, "O death, where is your sting?" is beginning to ring out. So as much as we might want things to hurry up, to move past the moment, Jesus bent down and wrote in the ground. And beyond anything he wrote, this is an act of defiance against the timeline and desires of man. He will not be held by our expectations or timelines. The story continues. He straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Jesus examples here one of the key, fundamental, foundational points of being a disciple of Christ. Because he doesn't speak into the sin of the woman. He doesn't directly speak into the sin of the Pharisees. He doesn't look to condemn. He doesn't look to judge. He doesn't throw stones. Jesus doesn't go on the attack with this line. There are times as a disciple of Christ when I need to learn this response to a situation. Rather than coming with all that I want to say, simply leaving space for the Spirit to be at work. What Jesus does in this moment is he begins to take the established way of the world. And he sets the bar so high for the world's judgment that there is no man or woman who can attain to it. Jesus has just scrapped judgment in one act on the behalf of humanity. Who am I to judge any of you when Jesus says this? Jesus has just disrupted the order of society by saying there is no man or woman who has the right to judge another. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. By all means, take your pop shots at one another. But make sure if you do so, you are sinless. Because otherwise there'll be a stone coming for you from someone else. Jesus, with 18 words, answers their question, protects the woman, and steps into the mess with her. When we invite Jesus into the mess of life, he isn't some divine cleaner. He's the King of Kings. He comes to rule. But he'll also come to protect, to be our strong fortress, to be a place of refuge. And that's what we see here. This woman comes in a mess, and Jesus' response is to stand between her and her accuser as her protector. He loves her already. These 18 words: protect the woman, step into the mess with her, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And then he returns to the ground to keep writing. Again, the defiance of Jesus in this moment is incredible. Because before anyone can answer back, before any of them can come with a snappy response, he's just done with it. Jesus in this moment points out another key fact of who he is. He is the authority. He has the final word. There is no comeback. There's no debate. There's no discussion to be had. Any of you without sin, go ahead. I don't want to hear your excuses for why you think that one mistake you made justifies you throwing. There's no discussion. Jesus is done. He said his piece. It's done. Jesus knows full well when he returns from being bent, writing in the ground, the woman will still be stood there. There is no debate to be had. His word is final. Jesus steps in, protects the woman, establishes his rule and reign in a subtle but powerful way. I've always assumed as the Pharisees and the teachers walked away that it was with the shame of whatever Jesus wrote on the floor. That may be true. But I can't help believe part of them walked away in wonder of who this Jesus was. That wonder may have turned to anger. But in this moment, I believe they began to see another way of doing things. They would need to make a choice in their own lives. Would they accept this or reject this? But I don't believe anyone walked away from this encounter without being impacted by who this Jesus was. What an incredible moment that was playing out before them. And leaves us all with that question, as I pointed out a minute ago, who are we to condemn another when we look at these words of Jesus? How often have I held a metaphorical stone over the heads of someone when making my point about the mess of their lives? Why do I not enter in with love and instead enter in with judgment and condemnation? Jesus, we need to ask for forgiveness, for we are sinners, and we don't have pebbles, let alone stones, that we are able to throw when we look at that line. And then we conclude with this. We've seen already that Jesus isn't held by man's timeline, that he will advocate for the sinner. He's comfortable amongst the mess of life, not looking to rush away. And then we have this conclusion to the encounter. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." When Jesus was born into that messy situation, when Jesus was born into the reality of that power struggle, when he was born into the reality of what life looked like for people, he was not simply born to be a spectator. Jesus wasn't just God's eyes on earth like a Ring doorbell. Jesus came to be a part of life and be a part of the reality of life. Jesus was born into that setting, visited by shepherds and kings, because he was coming to change that which was happening. He was coming with a purpose. In fact, he was born to die. So yes, Jesus is okay with the mess. Not the reality of the effect it's having on our lives, but with the evidence that he is willing to step into it with us. He's not distant from you when you are in that place. Stood before the woman, we see the truth, that he is not overwhelmed by the situation we find ourselves in. But we do need to hear this truth. If we invite Jesus into the mess of our lives, then we need to know he isn't coming to simply be a spectator. If we are going to invite him into the mess, he's not just coming to spectate, but to be a part of a purpose for your life and to move you through the mess. Jesus isn't just content with saving her life from the stones. The impact of this encounter has a profound effect on what will be next for this woman. Jesus comes to change and transform lives, be it emotional, sinful, financial, relational, whatever it might be. Jesus is going to be about making changes in your life if you invite him in to the mess. And it's not going to be because I said so or because Mark said so. It's not going to be because of the pressure of family or friends that you change the situation. Real change, can only come when we invite Jesus into the reality of our lives, and the messes that we face. That's when change comes. Why do so many people end up with unspectacular stories of who Jesus is in their lives? Because they bench him at the hardest times. We put him to the side because we're embarrassed of the situation rather than inviting him in, believing that he can change the situation before us. I want you to consider this as we begin to conclude. This story, I believe, is a wonderful picture of a bigger gospel message. Because humanity was condemned to death. Humanity was condemned to death, an eternal separation from the Father. That was the reality. Stood in our shame. And then Mary gives birth to a baby boy. Humanity was condemned to death, eternal separation from the Father, and then this teenage girl gives birth to a baby boy. And then on the cross, Mary's boy broke the power of sin and shame. We see here that reminder that baby born in a manger would go to the cross because we were condemned to death and separation from the Father. As the woman stood before the Pharisees and the crowd, condemned to death, Jesus stepped into the reality of the mess and made a way out for her and for us. So the answer is no. No, there is no mess in your life too big for him. Whatever it is you may be sat with, it's not too big for Jesus. As the woman stood before Jesus, she received love, she received validation, and she received the opportunity to make a change. Not because the Pharisees told her to, not because she was shamed into it or condemned into it, but because God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, so that whoever believed in him should not perish, but have eternal life. God sent his Son into the reality and into the mess to save the sinners. God sent his Son into the reality of the world to save me and you. In fact, we read that Jesus loved us so much, he was willing to show the ultimate sign of love. We read these words as we close. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends.